record this meeting. What we do is we put these up on YouTube after every call. So sometime after this call later today, this will be posted on the MicroProfile YouTube channel. And you can also go back and watch all of our wonderful meetings as well. So welcome to the January 14th iteration of the MicroProfile Live Hangouts. It is everyone's shared responsibility to take notes. The agenda minutes, a link to the agenda minutes are in the chat, and feel free to maybe post that link again. I think it only shows up if people join after we have the link. All right, I was logged out again because it says my account is logged in from another device. I don't know, so I'm hoping. Well, I'm still recording, so we'll see how this goes.
I shared the minutes again.
Okay, thank you. Please go to the document and add your name, and optionally add your organization or just individual or something like that. Okay, so today's agenda, really just one item, and that is the MicroProfile Working Group Introductory Call. So what I'm going to do is I am going to, I normally share my screen. I have some slides that, let me paste this in here to the chat. This is intended to be a discussion, but we did want to have, sorry, I got 3 monitors. So if you see me not always looking straight ahead, I'm still paying attention. I just got to find out, oh, I can't chat because I'm not signed in. Okay, I'm gonna keep kicking somebody out, I think. Now it says, okay, Kevin, yeah, can you go ahead and do the recording, because it keeps kicking me out, and I think we have too many people joining under this account.
Okay, it says that it is recording, but I will see what happens if I try to do it.
Okay, because it started converting the recording already. All right, so here's a link to the slide deck. This is new technical difficulties we haven't had before. And what I'm going to do is share the screen. And Google Chrome, MicroProfile. All right, do folks see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm going to go full screen mode here. Everything still look okay?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next screen here. The agenda. So we thought, you know, there's a lot of ideas being discussed regarding the working group proposals. So we thought what we would do here is set a meeting agenda, realizing that this is most likely going to take more than one meeting, right? So we thought we'd talk a little bit about the founding principles, what is currently in scope and outside of scope of the proposals. This is not a fixed scope, right? We're not trying to say what's out of scope. What we're trying to say is this is currently what is covered in the proposals, right? And the scope can change. And then some recommendations on maybe how we can continue this discussion and then open this up. In fact, I might switch those 2 around. All right, so MicroProfile founding principles. So let's see, David, do you maybe want to take a crack at this?
Sure. I guess I'll just go through kind of some of the thoughts that were in our head when we launched this stuff off, because we talked about a lot when MicroProfile was launched, and that was 3 years ago now, and I don't know that we have had active refreshing of that conversation since. So, you know, one of the questions that we got very, very frequently was, you know, are you trying to kill or replace the JCP and general things like that? And, you know, when MicroProfile started, it was with the intent of existing beside the JCP as its final resting state, as a place that's outside of that system, which has kind of a lot more overhead and processes, and is really designed to make things last forever, to create a place where we could basically collaborate, get things wrong, completely throw them away, try again, and keep trying till we get it right. And with the thought that when ideas were finally good, we could roll them into, the longer term standards initiatives. We even filed the JSR, which was the config JSR, right? So that gives you some indication of how we had imagined the technical relationship between the two of them to go. There were a lot more than technical things that we did differently. Specifically, MicroProfile was started as a completely open source with 0 bar to entry. No dollars must be paid to come to the table and be creative, right? And we have not even had the concept of a vendor role in MicroProfile for the last 3 years. So everybody who contributes to MicroProfile contributes as an individual. And when we do votes, everybody's votes count, no matter if there are 4 people from Payara, 8 people from Red Hat, and 8 people from IBM, and 3 people from Tommy Tribe, and a bunch of people as independents. So it has also intentionally been a place where we don't, define processes in advance. We solve the problems when we have them. And in general, we were trying to do almost everything the opposite of what we had been doing to see if we could get a different outcome, right? And so one ecosystem is paid. We'll see how that goes. One ecosystem is free. We'll see what that can produce. One ecosystem prefers backwards compatibility over the long term. The other ecosystem is okay to ditch backwards compatibility. If we get something wrong, we can reinvent until we get it right. One ecosystem is kind of a vendor consortium, and people are there as their vendor roles. The other ecosystem is just everybody's there as people, and it's completely open source project to as much as possible. And so, a lot of these things are what got the project started. Even things that make the projects different are how logos are handled. One ecosystem, you get the logo once you've crossed a certain threshold of compatibility. The other ecosystem, we're not strictly checking for compatibility. It's sort of on your honor and loose, and the logo goes wherever it needs to go. And it's open to anybody to use, pretty much. And so they're not just different technically, but they're very different in how we have attempted to work together, right? And so that's an important aspect that needs to come into the conversation. We also, I think, really need to come to some agreement. Is this important to us? And if it is important to us, what is the right way to make sure that it's protected as we change MicroProfile to adopt the specification process, right? And so we sort of need to go back and make sure we're all on the same page in terms of what we were trying to do with MicroProfile technically, and in terms of how we collaborate together, what has to change and what can we keep the same, and what is it that we want to do together? Because if we don't agree on that, we're not going to agree on the working group proposals, right? I don't know if other people have any thoughts to add at this moment.
Nope. I think this is a good introduction, David.
Yeah, that was pretty good. All right, I'm going to the next slide here. The current proposals scope. Hopefully didn't miss anything. Not intentionally trying to, define what's in and out of scope. This is basically just a list of things that we think are currently covered by the 2 proposals, right? So this isn't comparing one proposal to another. This is just kind of the things that need to be addressed overall. So David, I don't know if you want to take a crack at this, or Kevin, or
I guess or
myself, but
yeah. Why don't you take a crack, because I haven't read your slides yet.
No, that's fine. So yeah. So the current proposal scope, right? Starting out, what's the driver behind this entire working group discussion, right? Because we had been operating kind of as David mentioned, as a standalone, Eclipse project for, roughly 4 years, almost 4 years up to this point. So, what's kind of changed? Well, what's changed is the introduction of Jakarta EE and the realization that we had some gaps in how IP flows through specifications, right? So we need to make sure that, as we define specifications, that the IP flows from the originator of the idea and protects folks all the way, through the spec members, through the implementers, and through the end users as well, right? So there are some gaps in the IP flow that was kind of recognized during the transition of Java EE to Jakarta EE. So one of the things that what by and large will help us close that IP gap is going to be the creation of a working group, right? That will help close that IP flow. And some things around the specification process as well will probably also help. But this also brings up, the broader scope and intent of a working group in general within the Eclipse Foundation, right? You have folks that join the working group, and often associated with that are fees and budgets, right? How do you operate the working group? How do you promote the working group? There's a spec process that's required as part of our working group. As part of a spec working group, you have to have a spec process, right? And it needs, as currently defined, needs to be a derivative of the Eclipse Foundation specification process. There's some things that need to be resolved around logo and trademark usage, right? There's the MicroProfile logo, and kind of, how do we want to handle that? Compatibility requirements often, tied to the use of logos and trademarks, right? How do we want to handle that within the working group? Technical alignment. One of the things that's kind of popped out in the discussions is, well, how do the specs in MicroProfile align technically with the specifications in Jakarta? And what's interesting is that's actually not covered in either working group proposal right now, right? There is no discussion of technical alignment whatsoever, right? Maybe this is something that we should add, right? And how are subsets of spec projects identified? And I'll be honest, Scott, let's see. That's a Scott bullet. I'm not sure if Scott's on. So both proposals agree, as it's currently defined, on that there needs to be some level of different approaches between MicroProfile and Jakarta EE. So if you look at both proposals today, they each have their own specification committees and can define their own specification process. Separate marketing committees. Both proposals kind of currently agree that each can basically market the brand and the logo usage, how each project kind of sees fit. And there's also a separate budget, meaning that the money spent, for example, within MicroProfile are defined are what's the right word, managed by the MicroProfile committee, and vice versa for Jakarta EE, right? So this is currently, both proposals have these things in mind. The one thing, and technical alignment really is here. It's outside the current proposal scope. That bullet probably should not have been in the last slide. But we don't really cover this, as I've mentioned, in either proposal today. Now note that the things that are in and outside of the current two proposals, you know, the scope can change. Maybe we do need to cover technical alignment between the two projects, right? Or maybe there's other things that we need to consider that are not defined in either slide, right? What's in and out of scope. Maybe we're missing a scope item. So just a little bit of ground setting with where we think we are with the two proposals in terms of scope. Did I miss anything? I don't know, David or Kevin, do we think we have that scope as it's currently kind of covered in the two proposals? Anybody else? I think
that's a high level. Is that all the slides?
No, I got just a couple more. Okay. Really want to focus a lot of, yeah.
Yeah, I guess I just want to stress because when I was reading through the thread and when I see people talk, most people are commenting technically. And that's, I think we just need to stress that having them together or separate, first of all, I don't necessarily like those words, because they imply like distance or collaboration is there or is not there, and that is not the case. And so whether or not we have, I'll say one of the, so I will get on my own way. There isn't anything in either proposal that makes the relationship technically between MicroProfile and Jakarta EE easier or harder.
You push it back to some things, right?
Right. So, if there are hopes that they would somehow become more technically aligned because of the way we form the working groups, it doesn't factor in, right? So once MicroProfile is using the Eclipse specification process, the IP that comes out the other side is clean and can be used across all of the specification projects in Eclipse, right? Not just in the Jakarta EE, but everywhere, right? And so when we talk about the differences between the two working groups, concepts, and maybe there's a third one that we haven't thought of yet, right? So that's a very real possibility. One of the things I always notice in standards is, or just conversations with people say, do you want to have your cake or do you want to eat it? It's like, well, I want both, like the old beer commercials, less filling or taste great. Well, I want both, So there are probably aspects of A and B that we like, and we may come out with proposal C, and that's totally realistic. But wiping away the fact that once the MicroProfile specifications are released under the Eclipse specification process in some way, that's a constant no matter what. What this ultimately boils down to is, do we want a single steering committee that works the same way the Jakarta EE steering committee currently works? Or do we want a separate steering committee for MicroProfile that perhaps works differently, right? And there are some important details on this, right? The Jakarta EE steering committee meets privately, weekly. On the MicroProfile side, the proposal that we have is that we do not meet privately. And everybody is allowed to come to the meeting. And no decisions can happen, as matter of practice. Everything is done out in the open, right? With everybody accessible. And the regular every other week Tuesday call that we have already, the MicroProfile Tuesday call, that would effectively be our steering committee call, right? And we wouldn't have any other steering committee calls unless there was something that truly pressured us to have to meet privately, but we would avoid it at all costs, right? And so, that is a big difference. I also want to point out that there is, a concept that we have to think about, which is, do we want to encourage multiple vendors to come together at the Eclipse Foundation to do things related to Java and have the ability to create their own working groups together and have that be encouraged? Or do we want to have one big group for everybody and say, if you're not in the group, you're not in, right? And when we think about that question, I think we need to think about how things went for us over the last 20 years of Java middleware, and why we never attracted people like Spring and Drop Wizard and all the other types of people who were working in the Java middleware space in open source, right? There was something about our tight group that they didn't either want to or found easy to permeate. They went off and did their own thing, right? So we do have to ask the question, if people aren't liking what we're doing, is there the ability for them to go off and do their own thing, preferably at Eclipse, under the Eclipse specification process, where we can use the stuff that comes out the other side? Or do we say, if you're not in the single working group, you're out, go to the Linux Foundation, because this is the only show.
Or
right?
create your own foundation, which happens a lot.
So, we do have to think about the fact that in some regards, when I look back over the last 20 years and I see a lot of the stuff that happened outside our ecosystem, but using our technology, right? Like a lot of Spring uses Java EE technology. Drop Wizard uses Java EE technology. It's all JAX-RS based. But they are not identifying as being in our ecosystem. If we don't make it possible for these people to come, even if they don't want to come in our working group, they can come next to our working group in their own little group at Eclipse. That's still better than if they're way off in the corner in their other place, right? And so we have the concept of unity between us, the people who are here in the call right now. That's the easy win. How do we get everybody to come to this table, right? How do we ensure that in the next set of 20 years, the next Spring happens here rather than somewhere else? And if the bar is there and the bar is high and it's always growing, we can pretty much be guaranteed that we're not going to see that innovation happen right next to us. At least that's my opinion, but it's an open question, right? These are some of the things we have to think about. I guess I'm going off on a tangent, and I don't know how many slides you have, John.
Can't hear you, John.
Yeah, I caught myself a little bit late, but yeah. So not very many. That's the rest is really going to open up the discussion here just shortly. Additional info. This is just for those that may not have seen all the discussions and so on. These are just links where you can go take a look at the discussions. Feel free to do that. You could also see the MicroProfile live hangout meeting minutes. Well, we already have the link in there, right? But so this is just information for folks that may not be fully up to speed on the discussion. So I'm going to actually hold off on this recommendation aspect. Basically, we know that we're not going to be able to resolve this discussion through completion in just this call. So I'll have just a recommendation about maybe how we want to continue on this discussion. But now it's basically, let's open up the discussion to some thoughts that folks may have as it relates to what's been discussed so far. So it's an open forum. I guess the first one to the mic kind of wins.
Well, I guess I have questions for other people, right? So what do people think about the non-technical differences between MicroProfile and kind of the fully vendor-focused ecosystem that we had in the JCP and recreated in, you know, Jakarta EU. How do you view MicroProfile in relationship to that? And do you think it's important that we have kind of a community that is very vendor defocused and more flat and plain open source and meets publicly wherever possible? Is that something that is important to you?
So, like, I'm playing the devil's advocate here, since I'm not representing a major vendor. But I do think that the working group or the community needs to be interesting to vendors. Like, if it's all to open source, then maybe not a lot of things happen all the time. Like, the private individuals, they don't have so much time to invest. The majority of contributions to open source still happens via vendors. So, like I said, I'm playing devil's advocate here, since I'm not representing a major vendor, but I do see the importance that community has to be interesting and open to vendors, and even be lucrative to vendors.
And
Arjan, this is Amelia.
Arjan, just
Doesn't matter.
En español, stop it there. For some reason, I couldn't understand you because you were not concise.
He was
concise with one sentence, or do we need to repeat, or someone else can repeat what you tried to say, because I didn't understand you.
I can summarize, and you can see how good my listening skills are, Arjan. So
Right.
you were you said that, you know, that the ecosystem needs to be attractive to vendors and provide them a way and it needs to even be lucrative for vendors because they are a factor, and they need to win, right?
Yeah, so
They contribute a lot.
They need to be in. They contribute a lot.
Right.
So that's basically the point. Yeah, exactly.
Right. So I have a lot of thoughts on that topic, and I'm going to say some things that probably Oracle's going to love and everybody else is not going to like. So Oracle took it on the chin for backing away from Java EE, but the fact of the matter is everybody else who was a vendor had pretty much backed away first, and they were just the last people out the door. And since they were the ones holding the spec lead position on the majority of the specs, they got singled out. And, you know, the JCP ecosystem for Java EE, in my opinion only, and as an individual here, because as I've been in this 20 years, I don't believe it failed simply because Oracle woke up one day, became evil, decided to kill it, woke up the next day, became good, and decided to open source it. It was a long kind of creaking ecosystem that ultimately started to not serve itself well, right? And vendors who were participating in it, in my opinion, thought, I'm not winning here. Everything that I contribute, I got a license back. This isn't a great ecosystem. There were other things that people had tried to change repeatedly in the JCP and couldn't get changed, and ultimately started backing away from the ecosystem, and it resulted in basically Oracle being the only actual vendor there and just independence. And so, you know, that was kind of the way Java EE 8 was delivered, was primarily Oracle and independence. And so that ecosystem tried several things to fix itself and to make things better. All while that was happening and the slowdown was happening, and I'm talking about the slowdown of everybody prior to 2015. While the slowdown was happening, we were making tons of changes to the JCP to try and make it more open and transparent and more friendly to open source. We made it so all the specifications had to be operated in the public. Even the source code was out there in the public. You know, the TCKs were not, But
yeah, I apologize for interrupting, David. Sorry about that. Yeah, first of all, there is some noise in the background, so if you're not speaking, please go on mute. Second is, I do plan on posting the group chat to the meeting minute. I mean, to the video upload.
okay.
So I know people are chatting, so kind of just realize that these things will be added to the, they will be public, the chat. So just an FYI.
Right. So I'll get to the point. The point is that even though it was an ecosystem where everybody's at the table, and even though people were paying licensing fees, they weren't necessarily contributing, and the ecosystem basically stopped working. And so what protects us if we have one working group for everything? What protects that from happening again? Right? And what do we do if it does? Right? And one of the things for me personally is I don't want all my eggs in one basket anymore. I prefer to have at least 2 baskets. And I don't mind that it's quote unquote all the same people, because it's all the same people in the JCP. Everybody here on the call is part of the JCP, but yet we're still here on the call as Eclipse people, right? So why does it matter that we hear, if it's all the same people, why couldn't we just made things work at the JCP, is my devil's advocate statement. And it's just sometimes when you build up, you take a relationship and you imagine how it's going to work and how you're going to deliver things. You put the financing behind that, you build up legal agreements behind that, and then you're stuck. And now you've built something, you've built several years of material under that arrangement, and to change it is not easy. And that was, realistically why it was difficult to make some of the several of the changes that people wanted to have made to the JCP. So for example, when I said, hey, we need to have open source TCKs, and the entire licensing model is based around proprietary TCKs, that's a huge change to everything. And we all learned how long it takes to make that change. It takes about 4 years to make that change. So right now, MicroProfile is a no-cost community, and that has had advantage to vendors. We saw Lightbend come into our ecosystem for a while. They tried to get a couple specs going. It was really just James Roper who was doing it, and he didn't have to get a big sign-off from Lightbend in order to come, because there wasn't a barrier to entry. He could just show up and start contributing.
I apologize, David. I'm just going to insert a filibuster rule here.
Sure.
just hoping you can kind of close down your thought.
Well,
By the way, one last
if
thing for everybody. I tend to manage the clock on the microphone.
Yeah, I appreciate it. So the question is, back to to you, Arjan. What do you think Lightbend's role would have been in MicroProfile were there a barrier to entry, where they would had to have been confident enough to pay money and sign it right off the bat before contributing anything?
Yeah, I was like, I'm not really sure about their contribution. It's hard to say. I mean, like eventually, but they did. Yeah, like I said, I'm not really sure about how to answer this. So I think that in the current situation with Jakarta, it's not that difficult to join.
Arjan, how do you know it's not difficult when I have data and stats that prove that it's difficult to join today?
Well, I'll just say, for example, Talend, they they maintain a lot of Apache CXF, and first of all, I do not want this to be a beat up on the Jakarta working group thing. There's nothing wrong with it. We have the ecosystem we need. The question is, do we want another way for us to work together that doesn't have the same mechanics, right? So they came, it was it cost money. They couldn't get that approvals internally. They didn't want to be paying to contribute to open source. And so, they ended up not joining the working group, even though that they do implement at the Apache Software Foundation a lot of Apache CXF, which implements JAX-RS and JAX-WS.
But
Lightband.
Sorry, David, but as an individual or even a company, you can always open issues, make comments to issues, open pull requests, and I guess that doesn't cost you any money.
Well, we're changing. It was not the case if you were with a large company, but we are changing it so that is possible, right?
Yeah, so as an individual, it's quite easy to join, or a small company in my case, it's quite easy too. I mean, it's basically what Rudy says. You open up a PR, you contribute, you post to the mailing list, you sign some stuff, and that's essentially it. So in that sense, there's not too much to it. Of course, if you join the working group as a strategic member, then you do have costs.
Sure. And also, like I say, on the MicroProfile side of the fence, we've typically had a 0 bar to entry for companies to come in. And do we think that that's important?
So clock management point. Again, I insert myself every once in a while. So I'd like to reserve the last 10 minutes of the call to cover how we want to continue having these conversations, and a little bit of maybe what those topics should be, right? So we have roughly 9 minutes to go on this call to have the open discussion, but I would like to reserve some time to talk about what to do in the future. All right, keep going. Thanks.
Okay, so to move to a slightly different thing about the technical alignment, since most people were talking about that on the mailing list as well. But that's obviously what most people are thinking about, I guess. So indeed, the non-technical stuff matters. It needs to be correct. For instance, if Jakarta would want to use the config API, then the IP needs to be cleared. It can't just use it otherwise. But for the technical stuff, the technical alignment, I mean, I think that should be done in some way. Suppose, for instance, that Jakarta decides to go a completely different route with JAX-RS, with Jakarta REST. MicroProfile still depends on that. But if Jakarta goes a different way with CDI, how would MicroProfile respond to that? But if they have wildly different ideas about how CDI should evolve, would MicroProfile fork CDI and maintain its own project like CDI MicroProfile and CDI Jakarta? Would we want something like that?
If I may join in here, because I want to make a bridge there. On the point you just mentioned, I think it's a very good question to ask the real question that we started here. If you have such a situation that Jakarta wants to deviate the specification from MicroProfile, is that going to be better solved within one working group or two? Because whether we have 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 working groups, whether to go with that technical direction, adopting the same specification or going separate routes, I think is not a problem for one or more working groups.
Yeah, true. So the working group itself wouldn't facilitate that, indeed. But at least in my mind, and I might be completely wrong about this, it would be like a first step to have something in place that does tie the two communities together.
Well, so I'm going to reply to this this one. I think Mark brought it up. Mark Little brought up in one of his replies on the working group thread, where he basically says, it's the people, right, that matter, and we have a lot of the folks that are in MicroProfile are also participating in Jakarta and vice versa, right? There's overlap between the two communities in terms of participation. What's a little bit different is kind of the rules, right, around the working group about maybe how we want to participate in certain areas, right, in certain specs and so on. So I think that the communities would not, neither community would want to fork at all, right? So I think it would get resolved because, first of all, I think a lot of the people with implementations implement both aspects to some degree, right? They implement Jakarta or will implement Jakarta and implement MicroProfile as well. So I don't see that as a particular concern from my perspective.
Yeah, indeed. So it shouldn't be a concern because, like, practically it would be unfeasible to do it any other way. But then you would not have any guarantees that it's done.
You never have you don't have any guarantees anyway. But I think that where we left off, where we submitted a config JSR to the JCP as a pretty good indication of what we thought the right thing to do was, right? And technically, if we're going to stick to our guns that we can break any API in MicroProfile, then, that is the biggest determination of our technical future. Because on the Jakarta side of the fence, we've made the decision, and it's a good decision, we're going to be backwards compatible from release to release. The two concepts can't just live together, if in the way that we're imagining. It's fine for MicroProfile to live on top of Jakarta E because it's a stable base, and the MicroProfile can change whatever it wants, and you can use a release that you can use a platform that might happen to implement both, but you got to be aware that the MicroProfile sides of the fence can change. Now, if the Jakarta EE specifications themselves were to have a direct dependency in the APIs to a MicroProfile API, how do we maintain the rule that that API can change and break?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that's indeed
right.
the big question.
That's the big question, and it has nothing to do with working groups. Right?
Yeah, so you would think that some stuff like that would have to be agreed at some levels. I mean, you could imagine that config moved to Jakarta. Say config is quite stable, so the core of config moved to Jakarta. I mean, this is just
that is a way to handle it, right? That's clearly what we were trying to do when we submitted the config JSR. Is we're saying this is ready to be, this is stable, is ready to graduate, and we had filed the JSR to move it over. And right now, the thing blocking us from doing that is having a specification, using the Eclipse specification process.
Yeah, but I would not like the fact that if we move it, like you propose, that you have to change the package name, that you have to change anything, that you have effectively a fork. So
yeah,
if you move something, it should just stay as it is, but becomes another process, like you say, more stable, not the breaking stuff allowance that we have within MicroProfile. So if you consider that, is it then not easier to do if you have one working group than with two?
Again, that has nothing to do with working groups. That has to do with a technical decision that we would make, right? So when we were when we had proposed things to go into the JCP as the config API, it was with the intent it would change package into JavaX, and the proposal said JavaX config.
Yeah, and David, just to clarify, that was a requirement.
Yeah, that was a requirement of the JCP, but there's no such requirements for Jakarta. I think that
there is currently a
clarify that.
That is currently what we have on paper, which is that's the namespace we use for our specifications. So if we were to move it from one side of the fence to the other, then, you know, the way we have it on paper now is it would change. Now,
I think, if I'm not mistaken, that on the mailing list, this topic did come up, and I have to find where it was exactly mentioned, but I think that it was said that the package wouldn't matter. It doesn't have to be Jakarta. It could stay MicroProfile.
I don't know that we've had that.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that it was discussed, but I have to look it up where it was exactly.
I mean, I wrote the document that said what the namespaces should be. So my recollection of it is it's what we wrote. It's what I wrote down, which is it's Java X, and your group ID has, Jakarta, and your group ID has to be Jakarta. And here's the format you follow, and it was all modeled after Java X, the way we handled that, and everyone liked it and we approved it. So that is the last thing I recall.
Right. But there was another discussion, David, and I remember like what Arjan is saying, and I don't know if it was Mike or somebody spoke up and indicated that there would not be a requirement. But in any case, we can address that later.
Right.
Yeah, I think because I was involved in that conversation, I also asked Mike. Mike said no, doesn't need to be. Start with Jakarta EE.
Right. Well,
we could keep with MicroProfile.
You're talking about Mike Milinkovic?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so there might be what's willing to be allowed from the Eclipse perspective that a specification committee could do, but then there was. But as a specification committee, we did decide that you had to use the Jakarta namespace. So, you know. We just need to come back and revisit that. Now, the question though remains, do we want to, right? Because right now people are trained that if it's in the MicroProfile package, it can change. And do we want the ability to revisit ideas when we move things over onto the Jakarta side of the, if we do that, if we move things over to the Jakarta side of the fence when they're ready to go, do we want the ability to go, you know what, I always thought this annotation name didn't turn out to be the best one in practice. Maybe we want to use @config as the annotation because that's the most frequently used thing, and not use @config property. And so therefore we'll rename, things like that.
Yeah. I
meant to do a timeout. At first I did a cross like he's a vampire. So I really meant timeout. Sorry about that. Just again, managing the clock here. One of the things that we wanted to do was discuss how to continue this conversation. So what we normally do is, first of all, let's talk about meetings, I guess. We have the live hangout every other week, every other Tuesday, this time slot. And so what we'd like to do is and then historically we've reserved off weeks, which is currently this week, for other topics that come up. So what we would, I think, or what I'm recommending is, let's continue having this meeting during this time slot for as long as it takes to resolve this, right? Finish the discussion. And on the weeks that we have the live hangout, we'll try and reserve 30 minutes to have the conversation, because we still kind of need to operate MicroProfile itself, but we can focus on, the releases and stuff in that call, and in the rest of the time cover this topic. So, and then add this to the MicroProfile calendar, right? So everyone will be able to take a look at it.
Let me cut you there. A few microprofilers are saying +1, and that is great. My recommendation for this, because I think we should have the first 30 minutes of every call moving forward to this discussion, and have it be totally disciplined and ruthless with 11 a.m. to 11:30, and then that's it. Doesn't matter the topic and who is talking. It gets done at 10:30, at 11:30 PDT, and then we move to whatever else is in the agenda. If we prioritize these, we will enable those that usually do not attend the call, but could know that only 30 minutes, the first 30 are set up for this conversation. And this is my feedback based on availability and what we see. to make it boring and really, really disciplined.
Comments?
You want first 30 minutes or second 30 minutes?
First 30 minutes.
I'd say the second, because I think the other thing that comes into play is the architecture call, and that's on these Tuesdays as well.
Yeah.
So I think we got to stick with what was the content of the original calls. So we've got the Hangout calls and the architecture call, and we would do 30 minutes for those, and then we would revert to the working group discussion.
Yeah, I would agree. Like, just based upon our other conversations, like in the specification committee and stuff, whenever we had anything that was heated, we kind of had to put it at the end because it would just override the whole meeting otherwise. We need to get the easy stuff cleared away and then dig into the difficult stuff.
Well, the majority win. I disagree. But you don't have to agree with me. I just disagree. I prefer like hard first, easy later. We end each call.
It's just in practice when you try to wrap that conversation, everyone's still thinking about it.
Okay, so
Agreed.
So the other things I'm thinking, because we do this like we do this like every 2 weeks, just concentrate on this work group discussion. Why do we still need half an hour on the live hangout to discuss?
It's going to push it out too far.
Again.
It's going to push it out too far.
You mean the? So
yeah, it'll push out into March, April is what I'm referring to.
Why don't we continue like email conversation?
It's
email conversation. And
just
then
so much topic to talk about.
Hard to consume.
We have a lot of things to talk about, which are like, what would we want to do with regards to budget? What do we want to do with regards to how we handle the logo? How do we handle the balance between individual contributors and vendors, right? Do we want to make sure that individual contributors get a kind of larger, it's fairly significant stake? Then there's the topic of, I had another one in my head.
Okay.
It's a lot of stuff.
I agree with David. I think, in fact, David, I think you've managed to summarize and articulate the problem better in 20 minutes of this call than 2 weeks of email exchanges.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Mark.
So, okay. So I was trying to propose all these questions that we have that you addressed. Let's summarize them and answer them, and then with all these answered questions, maybe come to a conclusion, because I was wondering, what do we actually need to come to a conclusion? Because we have a question, do we need a MicroProfile working group? But what will answer this question exactly? With all the parameters that we have to think of.
Yeah, so given the time that we have, sorry, I do want to say additionally, we're not going to finish this conversation here, even on this topic. So what we could do is start a thread. I'll start a thread in the MicroProfile Google group where we can continue the conversation there. So we can continue to work in between these calls. So data point there. And I think there was Arjan, or was it Eva? Go ahead.
Okay, so one question I'd like to pose to the group is, how do we see MicroProfile going forward most? Is it like an independent ecosystem that can run all by itself? Or would you see it as an extension, set of extensions to Jakarta?
Well, that's a fundamental question that needs to be answered. What I'm hearing from the desire for a single working group is the ability to take ideas that are coming from external things, which is why it was brought into CN4J, into the stabilization effort under Jakarta, so you understand what you're actually consuming. But that really doesn't preclude having independent efforts. So frankly, I think this discussion for me is formalizing that there really is a Jakarta working group, and there are other groups that impact cloud native Java, but trying to deal with the complexity of how you have both independence and integration at a technical level, to me, seems undoable. So that's the fundamental thing that has to be answered. Because again, MP is just one example today. David has another one. What if we want to bring in Spring Boot? Okay, there's so many efforts out there that need to be brought into what today are enterprise customers and existing offerings, where you need to be able to reconcile legacy applications, historical backward compatibility issues, support of existing customers, as well as offerings that have potentially new profiles with new technologies. And I just don't see how, I mean, it basically gets back to David's fundamental question. You know, the JCP model, especially around a given profile like Jakarta EE, I don't think was proven to be successful in both vendors, product offerings, and innovation. So I think this discussion really needs to focus on that. Why is it that we cannot have a continuing innovation in MP and then still have a mechanism by which we consume that, you know, in a traditional vendor, enterprise vendor context? I think that's the fundamental question that needs to be answered.
I would say that
one of the fundamental problems with the JCP, and going back to what David was saying earlier about it, is that the original members of the JCP Executive Committee, their intention always was for for Sun originally, and then to eventually make Java a truly independent specification that all of the executive committee members would have equal rights to in terms of controlling, rather than just the single company, Sun, and then later Oracle, having the veto power to determine what goes into it and what doesn't go into it. And that's the huge difference between the Jakarta EE situation and the Java JCP. And that is that in Jakarta EE, no one company controls, okay, and has a veto power over everything that goes on in Jakarta EE.
That's one of the factors.
Here, data speaking was Mike DiNicola for Fujitsu Global. And I just want to make sure that everyone knows, because we continue to forget that everyone knows us. That is incorrect. So maybe in the future call, we say our name and then speak. Hey, Mike D, welcome.
Yeah, I'll just say that's one of the factors. I'll just say the barrier to entry was one of the things that affected us. You know, the cost of the TCK. We had an open source TCK we had access to. We lost that access. We went out without a TCK for a couple of years until we were eventually able to buy a TCK. Now, we have shifted the cost from TCK to membership. So the barrier to entry in terms of cost is still there. It's just different, right?
Right, and there's other subtleties. So we've gotten rid of some of the things, but there are still characteristics that are carried over because they were desired, namely that the TCK is used as a mechanism for gaining access to use of the compatibility logo, which effectively requires a fee. So, I mean, there's many levels of freedom and barriers of entry that we may or may not want. And in general, my argument has been out in that thread is that you have to have as close to $0 bar for development of open source specifications as possible. And so by definition, I do not see how the Jakarta EE working group can be used as a model going forward. I mean, you're just going to spend a bunch of time trying to create how that shared steering committee operates when the reality is you're effectively arguing, you know, how do external technologies get incorporated into that working group? So again, for me, it comes back to that question. What is it we are really wanting in Jakarta when we're saying that we need technical interoperation or use of MP or frankly any other Java-based API?
Yeah, so the question is indeed, what do you want? problem. I mean, I do see the advantage of having the more open, lower barrier to entry committee. On the other hand, if you're a small company or even an individual, it's quite hard to be involved with all the discussions, all the different committees, the bureaucracy that you would create by having those multiple committees.
That one I want to stamp away, because the intent of the MicroProfile working group proposal was not to is to change nothing about how we currently operate, right? Or as little as possible. So no additional calls, no additional hangouts, and everything still happens on the mailing list as usual. And the regular every other Tuesday call, that's our steering committee call, and we just call it the steering committee call. And then we also say that there aren't all these different committees. There's just one committee for the steering committee, specification committee, and the marketing committee. They're all the same, and we don't really care because we do all the stuff together as a community. Right? So the overhead was intentionally not added.
But you do still have the separate calls, of course.
No, you don't.
Nope.
I
said that we would not have any additional calls.
I'm not convinced that there's no additional cost. I was told, I mean, in the past, I was told there will be additional cost. Have you got confirmation to say there's no additional cost from Eclipse Foundation?
They don't have to, Eclipse doesn't have to tell us what we need to do. MicroProfile has proven in the last 3.5 years that we make it work as it stands. The extensions meet weekly, bi-monthly, it doesn't matter. Nothing changes. Should we
I don't think so. I think it's once you set up a worker group, there will be a cost associated.
That is not codified in any way. And it is, by the way, the board that does the final approval of working group proposals.
Yeah, I think we need to get that kind of cost issue sorted before we go forward. I think we all based on different
Emily,
assumptions.
I'm on the steering committee of Jakarta E, and I can guarantee if we decided to have a call once a month or once a year, it would be fine. There's no, there's no requirement of call frequency, and there's no requirement that they have to be private.
I mean, sorry, David, can I cut you off? It's not a call. I mean the dollars.
Excuse me?
I mean the money associated with the work group.
Oh, well, that's a different topic.
So dollars.
Yeah, and I apologize. I'm gonna kind of do the timeout thing here because it's gonna open up another discussion, right?
Right.
So let's continue this. Yeah, money's a whole different topic. So let's continue the conversation in the Google group thread. If I don't create it, someone else go create it first in the live hangout. Sorry, in the working group. So
no, you have to do it. You need to send a link to the video. This is amazing. So
the next call, same bat time, same bat channel. This place in a week. I hope to see everybody there, here and more, hopefully. So let's continue the conversation offline. And I found this to be a very helpful and useful call. So thank you, everybody.
Yep, thank you.
All right, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, bye.
Thanks so much.
Awesome. Bye, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.